of you know me from certification and from LEU applications that you have submitted, and I have hopefully approved. You might not know that I also am a lawyer. I went to IU Bloomington School of Law, and I've worked for all 3 branches of government as well as a couple of nonprofit legal organizations. Like many other areas of research, most legal research is done online now. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And here is a little roadmap of how I'm planning for things to go. And this may all go out the window, but this is what I'm aiming for, which includes leaving time for question and answers at the end. I want to start by telling you that I put together a 3-page resource guide that will be available for you to download at the end of this presentation. And it links to each of the resources that I mentioned in the presentation and to several additional useful resources that I may not mention in the presentation. But I want you to be sure to download that, because in the long run, it may be the most valuable thing you get out of attending today. Like other areas of research, most legal research is done online now, so that's what I focus on in both the guide and the presentation. The only resource in the guide that doesn't have a link is I've made a reference to Black's Law Dictionary, and I'm not aware of any free version that's available online, but I still thought that was worth mentioning because it is pretty much the gold standard in legal dictionaries. So we're going to start with a little review of the 4 main sources of law: the Constitution, statutes, case law, administrative regulations. We'll talk about the last 3 in the next couple of slides. Just a quick reference to the Constitution, as, of course, the U.S. Constitution is preeminent and no other law should conflict with that. Also to point out that the Constitution's main function is to put limits on government, and so most of what a Constitution is going to talk about are things that the government can and can't do. The state Constitution can grant greater rights than the federal Constitution, but it cannot grant fewer rights or less rights than the federal Constitution. So the judicial branch, legislatures pass laws and the courts interpret them. Case law refers to the body of law that appears in the court's written opinions. And generally, what you need to know is that trial courts usually don't issue opinions, although they might issue orders, which you might be able to find an order from a trial court. Appellate courts issue opinions. And in Indiana, the Indiana Court of Appeals issues opinions that are sometimes considered unpublished opinions. And you might actually be able to find unpublished opinions, which is a little ironic, but even though you can find them, you should know that you should not rely on them. So they're not to be cited or otherwise considered binding. So state and federal court cases are published in a series of different reporters, and the citations to those reporters are usually abbreviated. State cases can be cited in 2 different ways, using a regional reporter or a state reporter, and probably the one abbreviation that you maybe most need to know about that is Northeastern, because Indiana is in the Northeastern region. So any Indiana cases you find may have a Northeastern site attached to them. At the end of the resource guide, I have a link to a reference that lists out the abbreviations for the different regional reporters and the Supreme Court reporters too. So if somebody comes in that wants to find a specific case, they just want to read Citizens United, the Citizens United opinion, finding that is a pretty straightforward thing. And I'll demo that in a minute, but something to keep in mind is that different orders and opinions may have been issued each step of the way. So if they don't have an actual citation to a case, but just the name like that, you might find it, or you might find a lot more than just what you're looking for. So for example, Brown versus the Board of Education lasted for years. There were multiple cases. There's more things you'll find than just one case coming up that says this is Brown versus Board of Education, the one you're looking for. I just mentioned that so that you know, have a sense of what might come up when you start looking for these things, and we'll actually look for something in a moment. Back to the two separate systems, your federal and your state systems. The legislative branch, Indiana Code, is where you'll find laws that are passed by the Indiana General Assembly, and the U.S. Code is where you'll find the laws that are passed by Congress. In addition, state agencies and federal agencies, executive branch agencies, have their own set of administrative laws. Rules and regulations that are passed by state and federal agencies do have the force of law. The actions involving administrative law may not start in the court. They would usually start at the agency with an administrative hearing that would either be before an appointed board or an appointed administrative law judge. But if the situation is not resolved at the agency level, then they would get kicked into court also, and there may be eventually court opinions that address how state or federal rules and regulations are interpreted too. So all of the legal authority out there is generally divided into two categories: primary authority and secondary authority. Primary authority is the law. Those primary sources are the law itself, and they include codes and cases, statutes and cases, and case opinions. Secondary sources explain the law, and they include legal dictionaries, legal encyclopedias, legal periodicals, annotations and treatises. Pretty much everything that's not a primary source is a secondary source. Primary sources are considered binding. If you're in the jurisdiction it came from, you have to follow it. Non-binding authority, all secondary authority is just there to be persuasive. It doesn't dictate what a court or a judge has to do or how they have to find an opinion. It's just something that you can use to persuade or to understand, for background information to understand. So, and just an example of when you might use each type of source, primary and secondary. You would want to look at a primary source if a patron asks you a factual question, like, is it against the law to drive a tractor on the street? Or what happened in that case? Or do I need to have a license to go hunting, fishing, or drive a boat? Those are things where the answer is going to be in the statute or the rule. Or if it's what happened in that case, the answer would be in the appellate opinion. You would look at secondary sources when the patron asks more of a process-related question, such as when did environmental laws start coming on the books, or what events surrounded the creation of the EPA Superfund sites. Those are the kinds of things where someone wants to get the big picture as opposed to more of a yes or no question, and that's when it makes sense to turn to a law journal or a treatise on the topic. So just to give a specific example of what you would find in a primary source versus a secondary source, looking at expungement, the first thing is the code site. What did the Indiana legislature pass on expungement? What does our current law say? You would look at the Indiana code to find the answer to that. The second site is to an Indiana case with the Northeastern Regional Reporter that I mentioned earlier, cited there. You would look at case law to find out what have Indiana courts said about expungement, or how have the courts interpreted that law. In this particular case, the Court of Appeals held that a trial court has to have a hearing before denying a contested petition. So the statute says that the prosecutor has to agree to an expungement, so a contested opinion would be if the prosecutor doesn't agree. This court thought, well, since the prosecutor has to agree, I don't have to grant this if the prosecutor doesn't agree, but the court said, no, you do have to have a hearing at least. Then my example of a secondary source here, those primary sources are specific to Indiana in this case. The secondary source is an article on recent developments at the state and federal level. It compares Indiana's law to a handful of other states that have been active in this area, and it talks about the reasons why expungement statutes are increasingly necessary. So that's going to give you more of a theoretical background and a historical background and reasons why the law is changing in this area. Taking the case site and the law journal site that were in that previous slide, just to give you a little idea of what these citations mean, the parts of the citation, the first one, the case citation starts with the parties to the case. The next thing is a volume number. That's the volume of the reporter, which is the middle part, the abbreviation Northeast third. It's the third series in that reporter. And then the next numbers are, the first one is the page site that the case starts on, and a lot of times that's all you'll see in a citation to refer to the case as a whole. Or if the citation is actually giving a quotation or is referring to a certain principle that was decided in that case, and then there might be a second number in the citation, and that would be where that specific quotation appears in the case. Next is the court that the case was decided in and the year that it was decided. On the law review article, it's not that different from other types of citations. You've got the author and then the title. And then the first thing that comes is the volume of the law review that it appeared in. The law review name is always quite abbreviated. And if you need to find what that actually refers to, in this case, it's Harvard Law and Policy Review. And a lot of times they're very obvious, LJ is Law Journal, but you can find lists online of what those abbreviations are if you just look up Law Journal citation abbreviations or something like that. Most lawyers go through school using a blue book that lists out all those abbreviations. And then the page and the year. So to look at a Supreme Court case, they're cited a little bit differently because this is due to the fact that there are 3 different reporters that report Supreme Court cases. So they have what we call parallel citations. And each of those 3 citations are to the exact same case, same date, same court, same version of the case. The difference is each of those reporters are formatted a little bit differently. So in this case, the first thing you get are the parties to the case. The next thing is the volume of the reporter and the volume, reporter, and page, but you get that 3 times. And the difference between those 3 are that the first one is going to be the official government version of the Supreme Court opinion as it was handed down. It's not embellished or dissected or made useful in any way beyond the text of the actual Supreme Court case. The next one is the West publication, which West has a series of keynotes they use to identify different issues in different cases. There's a whole bunch of different keynotes, but for lawyers doing research, they can find a keynote that is useful. It's the topic that they want, and then they can research based on that keynote and get a lot more information about other cases that may use that same keynote. And then the final version is Lawyer's Edition, which is just an annotated version that gives lots of other information that is relevant to someone researching that case. So just thought I would touch on that before we go on to federal resources. And I'll just say up front, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on federal resources because this is a very challenging area. And frankly, my best recommendation is that you not try to search the US Code directly, but rather consider what the topic is and try and figure out what agency regulates that topic and go to that federal agency website for the area of law that you're looking at. And then most agencies will also provide a link to the specific statute or act that they deal with. So you can get to the actual statutes that way, but it's a little more focused than trying to search the whole US code, which is many, many volumes long. So to that end, the first thing I listed on the resource sheet is usa.gov, which links to websites of departments and agencies and branches of government. So that's a way to get into finding that. And just as a little example, this is from the resource sheet, and I've just pulled up within the Department of Justice. There's a whole section of the website on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and some examples. There's documents that tell you specifically how to file an ADA complaint, as well as a whole list of publications and resources that have been put together by the federal government that include materials for state and local governments and for businesses and nonprofits. So I've done this with a variety of other agencies based on thinking in terms of what types of issues might your patrons be asking about. Where would you go to find information on those issues? Because this is more like regular research that you might do as a librarian, I'm not actually going to demonstrate this, but on the resource guide I've given additional links to a variety of areas that may come in handy. So now we're going to try and pull up Brown versus Board of Education. If you're specifically looking for a federal case, I'm going to give you a couple of different ways that you can find it through free services online. The first is using FindLaw, and this is the screen that comes up when you first pull up FindLaw. Gives you a little window. You can type in the case name and then hit search, and this is what it brings up. It brings up a list of cases. In this case, you can see that the results is that it's bringing up 5 cases. You can only see 2 of them here. So in the next slide, I scrolled down a little bit to show you, here are the 5 cases. 4 of them are actually Brown versus Board of Education. And this is really what I was referring to when I said some cases will be harder than others to find what you're looking for. If you already have a citation, it makes it a little easier because then you can look at these citations and figure out which one you want. If you don't have a citation, you might have to open several of them to see that some of them are really basically just short orders, and you know that that's not the whole Supreme Court opinion in Brown versus Board of Education. In this case, we want 347 U.S. 483, which was argued in was decided in 1954. So that's the second entry, and when I click on the second entry, this is what I get. And this is, through FindLaw, you get the full case access without any login and for free. So I'm gonna take a moment here to talk about, if you pull up an older case like this, this was more than 50 years old, the question might come up as to whether or not it's still good law. And I would be inclined to say that that's a question that should be referred to a lawyer or a law librarian, and here's why. There may have been this case originally, but then the next case might have said a person can do X, and the next case might have said a person can do X, but only in these circumstances, or only in this jurisdiction, but not in that jurisdiction. And then a third case might say a person can no longer do X. And then Congress or the legislature might turn around and say, we don't like that outcome, so we're going to adopt a law that does the opposite. So answering the question of is this good law is really complicated, and those are some of the things you need to be wary of, and reasons to always qualify your answer with, but I'm not a lawyer. And we will talk about that type of communication a little bit later. Also on FindLaw, you can get to this opinion summary archive where you can search by topic. So if you don't have a specific case in mind, but you want to see what's out there on any large number of topics, you can browse by topic on FindLaw. also for free. So the second resource I want to mention for pulling up particularly federal cases is the Public Library of Law. These same websites also will let you search for state cases too, but I think it's easier to go on the court's website to look for a state case. Sometimes if you have trouble finding it on the court's website, it might make sense to do a search here. But just to give you an example of how these function a little bit differently, I put the exact same thing into this site, the Public Library of Law. I put in Brown versus Board of Education, and then when I press search, it brought up, instead of 5 results, it brought up 841 results. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you're really looking for Brown versus Education, that might be kind of a hassle. Also, by the way, it's a much slower process. You have to give it time to search for these because it's pulling up so much more. These cases are related cases. These are all the cases that cite to Brown versus Board of Education, not just cases that are part of that case. So when might that be useful? Well, if you're looking for a recent case that cites Brown versus Board of Education, like what's happening not 50 years ago, but now in the area of desegregation, and are these cases still coming up? Or if you are trying to do research in that area as opposed to wanting to read that specific case. But let's say you still want to read that specific case. You can actually see the case citations actually on this whole first page. Brown versus Board of Education, the opinion you're looking for doesn't even come up. But you can lift the citation from here because you can see that most of these cases are all citing the same opinion, which is the one I mentioned before. So in the next screen, I put in that reference to 347 U.S. for 53. I'm having a little trouble seeing the tiny numbers. So to narrow down the results, I did the search again, this time entering that citation, and this time it just brought up the same case. It just brought up the exact same case, the case we want. There's two versions, there's two listings of it, but they're both the same case with the same date on it. So that gets you to a more on-target result. And then if you click on that, here's what you can get access to in the Public Library of Law. It brings you up a tiny little synopsis. In some cases, you get a little more synopsis than this because this is all sort of just a lot of space is taken up here by the different listings. Some cases give you a little bit better synopsis, but the point here is that in order to get access to the full case on this website, you would need to log in, to set up an account and log in. It's a free account, so you don't have to pay for it, but you do have to log in to get to the full access of the case. So that's what we have there. We're going to take a look now at the Indiana General Assembly's website and looking for Indiana-specific statutes and legislative materials. If you go to the Indiana General Assembly's website, under the laws button across the there's a ribbon across the top that gives you different choices. One of them is laws. If you choose the menu item Constitution, and you can see here the ribbon that says laws, and underneath it the choices of Constitution, Indiana Code, non-code statutes. If you choose Constitution, it brings the Constitution right up, and it's not a terribly long Constitution, and you might want to read it sometime. It is sort of interesting, and because it's quite different from the federal Constitution, and in some areas may seem pretty familiar because it's also overlaps a bit with the federal Constitution. Looking up Indiana Code, which is the most useful thing you can do on this Indiana government website. Before we start looking at it, just a few minutes about how the Indiana Code is organized. So an Indiana Code site is usually 4 numbers long. It may be shorter than that. You may see a shorter site if they're not referring to a specific section, but to a whole chapter. But the order of those numbers is always the same. The first number is always the title. Second number is always the article. Third number is always the chapter. And if there's a fourth number listed, that would be the section of that chapter. It's helpful to know that the Indiana Code is organized into 36 titles, and these are large main subject areas. So, for example, education is one of those 36 titles. Criminal law is one of them. Civil law is one of them. Property is one of them. Elections is one of them. So if you're not sure what area you're in, you can actually start by finding the title and then narrow in what you're looking for from there. It's a bit like using an index with you can see the titles listed on the left-hand side, and then if I click on the probate title, it brings up the articles that are in the probate code. And along the left, these are all selection points you can make. And by the way, because the General Assembly recently revamped this access to laws on their website, on the resource guide, I listed a link to a little explanation of how to use this site too, that may be helpful if you find it difficult, or if you've used it in the past and found it easy and now suddenly find it more difficult because of the changes that they made. It sort of addresses the changes. So you're narrowing down what you're looking through first by selecting the appropriate title, and then once you bring up the articles in the probate code, clicking on Article 3, now you can see the chapter titles listed under Article 3, and we're trying to get to a specific section on, what needs to go into a petition for guardianship. And the reason I'm doing this as an example is because I had a request of people wanting to know if there's a guardianship form, and there's not a guardianship form, but here we're going to get to the chapter on proceedings for the appointment of a guardian, and then by clicking on that chapter brings up the section numbers, and then by the sections you can see, just go too far. We brought up the first section here, which is actually what needs to be in that petition. I'm not suggesting that you necessarily need to do this for your patrons by any means, but just to show you how you can use this left-hand side as like you're looking up in a book the chapters, which pages you want. You just keep moving through it to get to the more specific example. There's another way to get to the same place. And that is, if you happen to know what the exact code site you want is, in this screen, I put in up here, up on the upper right-hand corner, is a space where you can put in the numbers for the code site you want. And I put in the numbers that we just found going the other way through this. And then when you click the little magnifying glass for search, it brings you right to that section. So that's always going to be the easiest way to bring up a code site, but you won't always have the exact citation. In fact, unless somebody has been reading something that makes reference to a citation and says, how would I find this? That's when you would use this method. But because it's pretty limited, it's helpful to know these other methods. And I'm going to show you one more way to do what happens if you do a word search in here in just a second. One of the questions that somebody mentioned to me was, is it against the law? People want to know, can I do this? And that's a tough one to answer because you can't really rule out all the possibilities. You can maybe find something on point, but you don't know what you don't know, unfortunately. So how can you go about researching that a little bit? You can start by checking the criminal code, which is IC 35. That won't tell you, though, if there are civil penalties, and civil penalties also may mean it's against the law. It's just not a criminal law. Also, you might want to be aware of the fact that plenty of criminal laws fall outside of IC 35. And in fact, the last article of IC 35 is a whole list of cross-references to criminal laws that fall outside of IC 35. But if we wanted to look in IC 35, for example, to see what is the offense for possession of marijuana, just as an example. We would look in 35 until we found controlled substances, and then under controlled substances, you can see that the offenses relating to controlled substances, and then within that, possession of marijuana comes up, so you can move to that section and see here's the possession of marijuana statute. So that's pretty easy to find looking in Title 35. But then let's say you want to know about public intoxication. Well, that's not in Title 35. Why not? Because it's in alcohol and tobacco is the title that it's in, Title 7.1. But if you look if you use Title 7.1 like an index and look for the next article that has crimes and infractions, and you look in that article, you get to a chapter on public intoxication. So you can find these things by moving through the title to the article to the chapter in the section. Interestingly enough, though, you find public intoxication in alcohol and tobacco, but you don't find drunk driving there because drunk driving is in Title 9, motor vehicle chapter title. And again, if you look through the articles in that title, you'll find that there's one named general penalty provisions. So that's a pretty good tip that's a good place to start looking for motor vehicles. And in fact, Chapter 5 of that article is operating a vehicle while intoxicated. So I mention this for two reasons. One is that not all criminal law is in the criminal code. And the other is that finding law is similar to other aspects of librarianship in that if you don't find it the first place you look, it can be very helpful to think in terms of what else it might be under. You might think in terms of, so driving while intoxicated. Well, it involves a vehicle. You might think in terms of the relationships between people. If the issue is a landlord and tenant one, that relationship is over property, so you might look in the property code. It's just an example of finding things that aren't directly in the first spot you might think to look, but excuse me. So another option you could have going to the General Assembly's website is that in the upper right-hand corner, and you don't see it on the screen because I did the screenshot after I entered it, but in the upper right-hand corner, the same place where you could enter a code site, there is an option right next to that to enter a word search. And so this is an example of a word search that the thing I searched for here was operating while intoxicated. And I put that in the keyword box and hit the little spyglass for it to do the search. And you'll see that what comes up is in a variety of chapters. And there are other types of operating while intoxicated than you might have thought of, because operating a motorboat while intoxicated is also a criminal law. So that's just an example of using that word search box. Other things you can find at the Indiana General Assembly website, and there are links to each of these functions that are underlined on the resource page, resource guide. You can find bills by bill number, by subject, by legislator. You can find who your legislator is by putting in your address. You can, if you know, for example, if you know you want to look for the library bill that was passed this year, you could, if you have the bill number, you could stick in the bill number and it would pull it up, or you could look through the subject index and find it's listed. It's under libraries. There's actually library is one of the things in the subject index. So if you look under library, this is pretty much the only bill you'll find, and click on it and you'll find it. I've also given a link in the resource guide to digest of enactments, and that's a digest of every bill that passed during the session. And just to let you know, that some of the links in this paragraph, that it looks pretty much like what you see on the screen, some of those links end up being specific to 2018, so they'll work for you now, but if you try them again next year, and you really want to be looking for the 2019 session, just pay attention to that. Other links like Find Your Legislator are going to work next year and beyond, because it's going to take you to a different kind of a page on their website. Okay. So that was a big chunk of information. I have one more section I'm going to go over, but before I do, are there any questions so far? This is an opportunity for you to let me know what you want me to talk about a little bit here. And I'll give you another opportunity after the next session, but I wanted to give you 2 opportunities to check in. And while you're typing, I will just mention that I did have one person write to me ahead of time and ask about shepherdizing. So I'm just going to say a few words about that here. Shepherdizing is a process of reviewing case citations to determine if a case is still valid. This goes back to the conversation we had earlier about whether or not a case is still good law. So it used to involve going to a whole series of books to look up your citation over and over and over again. Now most people do that on a subscription service online, like Westlaw. And what they find online when they put in their site is a series of flags, red, green, and yellow. The green would tell you that the case has been upheld. Yellow would tell you it's been questioned, and red would tell you it's been overturned. Or if you're in a really complicated area of law, you might find all 3 of those. And sometimes you might find more than one of them even in one case, if the case upheld it in part and overturned it in part. So this is not something that I think probably you need to figure out, but just so you know what the reference is to. And also, if it is something you want to try and do on your own, just for the heck of it, to see what it's like, I have included an article on the resource, a link to an article on the resource sheet that talks specifically about shepherdizing cases. So there's that. Okay, how do you find out how your representative or senator voted? Since it's an election year, people want to know that information. Well, if you pull up a bill, you will see on the history, you can see in the history of the bill what the vote tallies were on that bill, but you're talking more in general. You know, there are different organizations that compile voting records based on the specific issues that they're interested in. Otherwise, but I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. You know, that's it's not a one-stop process, I would say. Resources for legal forms other than indiana.gov. Where? Okay, well, so most of the resources that I am suggesting are indiana.gov, and here's why. There are a lot of different websites that will provide legal forms, either for free or for some kind of cost. But if you don't know, in our experience, forms provided by government sites are going to be more reliable. That's really what the agency that handles that area of law is going to be the best one to tell you what should go into those forms. And so,
you provide some links to some forms?
Yes. So on the this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the guide here for a second, because I know that probably most of you actually know already that there are divorce forms available on the Indiana Supreme Court website, and that those forms are divided into a couple of categories, you know, with children, without children, contested, uncontested. So that's pretty easy to find and to make available to people when they come in. What you may not know is that also on the Indiana court site, and I listed 2 different places to go to. One is a portal, the public portal, and one is the self-service part of the site. Between the two, they offer a lot of different forms, including child support and information, child support guidelines, a child support calculator. I've listed a hotline number for child support. I listed the link to the divorce just because it's relevant, but even though most of you probably already know that one. There are expungement forms on the Indiana Supreme Court website. They're not necessarily that easy to find, but I've put a link to them. And in fact, if you go to the frequently asked questions on the self-serve site, it says that they don't provide expungement forms, but in fact, the form is there on the site. So they don't provide guardianship forms, and they give a reason why, and I've clicked a link to that reason so that at least you can answer the question that there's a reason the Supreme Court doesn't make that available. There's not a one-size-fits-all form for that. And actually, the expungement form is not one-size-fits-all. It comes in several different sections, so they have to go through each section of the form and decide, and then put those sections together. It is more complicated than most of the other forms, I think. Parenting time guidelines, mortgage foreclosure help, applying for a marriage license, and a parenting time calendar. There's a way to plug in information that can generate a proposed calendar for you based on the parenting time guidelines. And there's also an Indiana parenting time helpline. These are all listed under Indiana courts in the guide that I prepared as well. I've put links to small claims court information, and I know one person mentioned that they had trouble finding small claims court forms, and I've linked to small claims court forms for Marion County. And for all other counties, there is actually a guide online for taking a case to small claims court. I've also listed connections to Indiana Legal Services for eviction and immigration information, and some of those may contain some forms also. So, and then one other thing, I know I had a question about power of attorney forms, and there are so many different types of power of attorney forms. There's not one sample form. There is a sample form that came up a lot when I was looking at this, but it was not a reliable site, so I didn't want to use it. But there is one type of power of attorney form that I did find a reliable resource for, and that was for a healthcare representative, power of attorney for healthcare decisions. So I've listed 2 reliable sites for that give you sample forms where you can pick. One is an Indiana site, and the other is AARP, which has you can pick Indiana so that you get an Indiana specific forms. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to ask for questions again in a moment, but the next thing we're going to talk about is really important, and I probably have saved the most important thing for last. This is really the message that I hope you come away from this with, which is how to avoid practicing law, but also we're going to talk for a moment about why to avoid practicing law. So the Indiana Code of Professional Responsibility says that the reason unauthorized practice of law is not allowed is to protect the public from getting legal services from unqualified persons. So there's the issue of protecting the public if you don't really know what you're talking about or referring them to. Also, perhaps of more interest to you is because it's a Class P misdemeanor to do so. So I know you aren't going to do the things in number 1 or 2. You're not going to say you're a practicing attorney, and you're not going to go to trial on behalf of someone in a court in Indiana. I'm not real worried about you doing that. The third one is the one that you need to be probably most concerned about here, and that is engaging in the business of a practicing lawyer. And so it's important that you don't imply that you're authorized or competent to furnish legal advice or perform legal services. To avoid unauthorized practice of law, it may be helpful to know what the practice of law is considered to be, and it is can be summarized as activity requiring legal skills or special knowledge beyond that of the average non-lawyer. So I guess if I have a message for you, it's that questions like, is this still good law? That's probably something that requires special skills. Or can you shepherdize this case for me? Might also be something that requires specialized skills. So, just in case you were wondering, what are the consequences for a Class B misdemeanor? There's a maximum penalty of 180 days in jail, a fine of up to $1,000. You could spend up to a year on probation. So that's a pretty good reason to pay attention to. The next two slides, where I've shared some phrases to avoid, and then the one after that is going to be phrases that are your friend. So phrases to avoid, and my thought here is to just mention to you that as with doctors, there's a lot of specialization in the law. Your hand doctor doesn't necessarily look at feet. You probably don't want an orthodontist delivering your baby. And lawyers who specialize in one area, even lawyers who are trained in how to practice law, if they specialize in one area, they usually will avoid offering opinions about other areas. Why? Because when I stray out of my field, the biggest danger is that I might not know what I don't know, and that it's not what you know that's the problem. It's not what you don't know that's the problem, because you're going to be careful to say, I don't know this. It's the things you don't even know you don't know that are the problem. So I'm going to say that one more time. When you stray out of your field, the biggest danger is that you don't know what you don't know. And that is true for me as an attorney as well as for you as a librarian. Phrases that can be helpful and that I encourage you to use when you are helping patrons with legal research. I am not an attorney. Okay, some of you may actually be attorneys. I know there are a number of librarians who are attorneys. So I'm just going to mention this. Even as an attorney, I personally would not offer legal advice at a library unless my employer was paying my malpractice insurance for that specific activity. So even if you are an attorney, there's reasons not to go there in a different setting than in a qualified practice, law practice. In addition to the other phrases I've listed here, the idea of I can show you the resources, but I can't interpret them for you. I can help you find the books. I can help you print off forms. I don't have the proper training to answer that question. I've listed here also at the end, I don't know the answer, but I can point you toward how to find someone who does. I would suggest and encourage you to keep the phone number, if you don't already do this, of your local bar association handy, as many local bar associations have some kind of a referral service. But I also think it's important to know that the referral service that a person gets from the local bar is not going to be for free or even low-cost services. Because of that, I've also included in the resource guide a link to contact the pro bono districts. There's, I'm not sure how many, 7 or 13 pro bono districts around the state, and each one of them has a coordinator with contact information that can be a resource for finding free or low-cost legal services. I would also invite you to consider that there may be an opportunity here for you to partner with your local bar association or with your local pro bono district to provide information and resources. Invite the groups of people who can give legal advice to come to the library and do so. And just one other piece of information about trying to set up something like that. The state bar once a year does a training for attorneys to participate in an Ask an Attorney program. There are other bars that do this kind of training too, but once they've been in that training, it's designed to prepare them to do, a one-day project on Martin Luther King Day, but there's no reason they couldn't also create opportunities for events at your local library. And I know the pro bono districts actually like to work through libraries. So that's another possibility in terms of finding a way to make services available rather than relying on your own research skills. I also want to point out that even Sylvia and I use disclaimers. Things like, please note that the purpose of this email is to provide general information and not legal advice. And I've tried to do that both because it's a good thing to do and to set an example. I put that, information at the top of the resource guide that we're going to download in a second. And for legal advice, you have to contact an attorney. That's kind of just all there is to it, I'm afraid. So now is the next time I have available for some questions. And while you're typing, I will mention that I was asked about a one-page lease that somebody people have patrons that come in and say, can you print off a one-page lease for me? I could not find anything of the sort. So a lot of times the answer is just going to be, no, I can't help you. And yes, in the slide after next, we are going to show you where to download the resource guide. It's not a slide. In the next screen, in the screen after the next one, we're going to show you how to download the resource guide. Will be there. And great. I see typing, so I'm going to pause before I move to the last screen and see if there's another question that comes up. I'll go ahead to the next screen and still see if there's another question that comes up. I'll just say that if you're like me and you think of your question right after you leave the room or right after you get off the call or the next day, not to worry. Here is my contact information. And let's see if we have other questions. So I have a question, is it okay to direct individuals to the NOLO type books for form creation? I think it's fine to say we have this book or here's this book. I think in general the NOLO products are reasonably good. I just think you don't want to avoid saying here's how you do it. You should rely on this.
They may want to have their attorney view the final result if they use a form from the NOLO book.
Right. So here's another point that is worth making, and this is mentioned somewhere on the Supreme Court self-help site, I think, is that there are possibilities now of working out an arrangement with an attorney where you pay them less to do less of the work. You're not asking them to take the whole case, like if you do the forms yourself, and they just maybe read them over before submitting them, so that you can cut down on the cost of legal expenses, but by dividing up the work, having the attorney do just the things the attorney needs to do, and the client can do a little bit more of the legwork or the or research or pulling together things that they need. So I guess yes, they could certainly use that to save time and to save money. And if it's a complicated issue, it's still going to be a good idea to have an attorney look it over. I know a lot of people can't afford that, and unfortunately our legal system is not entirely just in that way. Okay, databases, should we help them find a specific, okay, if you have access to a legal forms database, okay. For those of us with access to a legal forms database, should we be helping them find the specific lease form, or should we just point them to the computers and have them look and choose themselves?
I'd say they could show them the different forms of leases, but that the patron should have to choose which one, that the librarian shouldn't choose which one they're going to use. Right,
so you can get them to the general area they need, and then have them figure out which one of those things they need. So.
And they still should have their attorney review the final result.
Okay, and I would also say, you pay the vendor for access to those databases. I think it would be good to ask that question of the vendor and see what they say about what's the appropriate way to assist patrons in using this resource. I think a lot depends, since I haven't actually used the database that you're referring to, I don't know how careful they are about having disclaimers on the database, but it never hurts for you to make a disclaimer. Okay, so if there are 10 types of rental agreements, right, I would say you can show them, here is the rental agreement section of this database, and let them select which of those rental agreements applies to their situation. That would be, that would make sense. Okay, and that's actually what Sylvia just typed. Okay, great. So we're just about at time now. I'm going to go ahead. I've got my contact information here for you, but what I'm going to do now is pull up this screen. Oh, before I forgot to do this. The formal content for the webinar is over now, so we're going to stop recording, but please stay with me for another